The virtual rainbow brings together LGBTQ+ youth and their families, community leaders, professionals, and healthcare providers to learn and celebrate diversity and inclusion. Thank you for joining, everyone, and welcome.
So today, what I was asked to do is to create something that has relevance to mental health and building connection, specifically, obviously, around LGBTQ populations. And so this is a little bit about who I am. I have worked as a sex educator for almost 10 years now, and I've been working toward my license in sex therapy to work with families and persons who are on that binary. I say rainbow people because whatever color that you are or fall in, I work with that population and have for a really long time. I'm also currently pursuing my PhD in clinical sexology to work in sexual health. This is my bread and butter. This is my jam. This is what I love. And so what I would like to do to just kind of get a gauge of where you guys are at is if you could just give me 2 words in the chat of what you guys are feeling. I mean, it's the end of the day. Where are you at? How much engaging and how much hand movement do I need to give you to engage you in this conversation? So just 2 quick words that describe you in this moment so I can just kind of get a pulse of who I'm talking to, since I can't see many of your faces, would be a dream. Super happy. Wow. Okay. Anyone else feel like they can throw themselves out there a little bit? Are you drained? Are you missing the sun? Are you feeling overwhelmed? Are you excited to eat dinner? As a therapist, I can outweigh your silence. Excited and anxious, so conflicting feelings. Ready to get outside, absolutely. So when we are talking about this specifically, I think it's really important to acknowledge that we're talking about connection, right? Mental health and connection. So where I'm leaning on you guys is for you to engage with me, to know how we can create those connections. Creating a connection through a screen obviously is substantially harder. So we're gonna try to do that a little bit. Today we're gonna talk about what mental health looks like for you and your demographic as far as LGBTQ, specifically geared toward youth. What's important about this, our stress response, and how that leads into our mental health, and then how do we connect and why this matters. So I wanna start with shame. So when I look at mental health across the board, it's really interesting, specifically with sexual health, how much of who we are is wrapped up in shame. And those scripts that we get often is that I'm never good enough, or who do I think I am when I am good enough? And those 2 themes happen to come up often. And there's a difference between shame, as in I'm not good enough, versus guilt, which is the behavior of I shouldn't have done that. So as you can imagine, with LGBTQ youth, it is this kind of cyclical thought of I'm not good enough. Is this really who I am? Is this really what I want? Because we're going against the norm. And that is encompassing of so many feelings, and why so many youth start to doubt themselves. And this can be such a contributor to depression and anxiety symptoms. The way that we can combat shame specifically is to get into to listening to one another, to being vulnerable. For those of you who maybe recognize this, this is similar to, or very congruent with what Brene Brown talks about with the need for being ourselves and our authentic selves to be able to connect. And the way that we can rid ourselves of shame is to empathize, to have someone who gets us at our core and says that it's okay, that that loving someone because of their heart and not their body is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. So it's finding a piece of ourselves to connect with someone else. It's finding the feeling that we have to be able to say, I've had that feeling in this way, even if it's not the same. And so I'm going to give you guys, as we move through this, hopefully a couple of skills to be able to create that connection. When we have high levels of shame, we see higher levels of addiction, suicide, eating disorder, bullying, violence, chronic stress, depression, anxiety, and the list goes on. So a way to address mental health, sometimes I think we think is medication or changing someone's diet or getting more sleep. But realistically, what we're looking for is a connection. We want to feel normal. We want to feel validated. And what I find interesting is through this research, specifically with LGBTQ, depending on how we identify, whether male or female, it ends up being gendered. For women, we want to do it all. We want to be perfect. We have this unattainable expectation of ourselves. And even when we achieve it, it's not good enough. So it comes back to that shame voice of, you know, I'm getting straight A's, I'm playing tennis, I'm also in theater, and I'm still not doing enough. I still won't get into the college I want. I still don't have friends. I'm still not dating someone. All of those things come up for women of having this high expectation and never being enough. For men, when I say men, I'm saying gender, those who identify as male, is that we cannot be weak. And what is really interesting is in preliminary research, and I say preliminary because for trans youth, we haven't had the longevity of research, but what we see often is those who are transitioning to male will feel a level of weakness for having emotion. But if you can imagine a trans male who goes through all the beautiful things of puberty and feeling all of those great emotions that come with puberty at times, how that can feel weak. And so addressing that of, yes, this is normal, these are things that we have to cope with, can be really helpful. So creating that empathy around shame neutralizes it. So it's very interesting because when I was putting this together, I kept, you know, of course I do research and where can I get these statistics and what can I offer you and what does it look like to be LGBTQ youth? And these are the things that I find. And when you see these things, it is so, it's so interesting because as someone who works in this population, I keep thinking, wow, have we normalized mental health issues? Have we ostracized those who are LGBTQ? I thought we were moving forward. Why are we seeing such high rates of suicide? Why are we seeing such high rates of depressive symptoms and anxiety? Why do people feel objectified often? And this discrimination piece. And so I really kind of lean into this of that lack of connection. Youth commit to their peers, specifically teens, like no other age group. Their peers are the most important humans in their life, and as much as parents, we want to be that person, during the teenage years, we move away from it. We want that independence. And ultimately, not having social support, not creating connection with one another creates this divide and this increase in mental health. So finding space to create connection, whether that be, you know, playing sports, whether that be what we read, what we do in our spare time, the more isolation, the more these feelings are amplified. We see it in the research with families, right? Is when families are supportive, our youth mental health is drastically better. So it speaks to this need to connect. I am going to focus specifically on depression and anxiety, because this is what I hear all the time as a therapist is I'm always anxious or I'm always sad. And it becomes this kind of like cycle, if you will, is into depression and anxiety. I'm feeling anxious. I feel awful for not being able to do these things or worry, which then cause depression. And now I don't want to get out of bed and I lack motivation. But then I'm worried about not getting out of bed and being successful. So then I'm actually going to lose more motivation. So it's this cyclical thing. Being able to say, I see you and I've felt that before and let's sit with that. I'm with you in this can be that game changer. For us as peers, as I'm supposed to be targeting our peers in youth, is we want to recognize where people are at. Are we addressing anxiety? Are we addressing depression? So are we excessively nervous? Are we focused? Are we worried? So we're kind of future tripping, right? We're thinking about the future, what could happen, versus depressive symptoms are increased sleep, hopelessness, low self-esteem, thoughts of self-harm. We're thinking about how it doesn't get better because our past proves that it doesn't. So being in the present is the most powerful tool that we can be, is let's be in this moment together. Let's stay out of the future for a moment because we can't control it, which sounds crazy. And also we can't change the past. We can't control that either. So let's stay in the moment and find what we can do right now. Let's connect. So this is just another kind of view of how intertwined these two are and how those symptoms come out. And I'm sure that some of you can relate to some of these at different times or see even for yourself how it's hard to decipher, am I dealing with anxiety or am I dealing with depression, and how those symptoms correspond with one another and how they can make us feel even more isolated, withdrawn, and alone, realistically. So I wanted to start with the everyday, the things that we do every day, the mundane and the basic. We wake up, we feed ourselves, we check social media, we might shower if we got up early enough. Hopefully we're drinking water, because we should be. We get dressed. These are the things that we do every day. They kind of keep us in a routine. We know what to expect. Focusing in on these things of doing those daily tasks, even if they're small, can build self-efficacy, right? Is, hey, you made it to class today. That's huge. During COVID, I feel like we have really leaned into, I have to celebrate the small wins. You guys made it today. You might not have pants on, but you made it. So that's a win. And celebrating those small wins can increase our ability to feel like we're moving forward, that we're creating that self-efficacy. So this is where it gets complicated, is then the day starts and stressors kick in. So schoolwork, relationships, our parents are nagging, our siblings are always annoying, particularly if you're the older parent or the older sibling. Plus all of your commitments that you've made. Stressors very much fill our day-to-day. But our self-care isn't as robust, if you will. So I want to just kick it to you guys, if you're willing. What kind of things do you do for self-care? How do you balance out those stressors? I personally eat cake.
And Hannah, I'll just start off with a question that came up to all attendees, so I don't think you got this. From a few minutes ago, how do non-binary people fit into these ideas of gendered ideas? Do we tend to be in between, or do we tend to drift towards how we were initially socialized based on what we were assigned at birth? So sorry to
Okay.
you can answer that afterwards, but and I'm seeing some other.
No, this is a.
some other items that are coming up based on what you just asked: napping, music, knitting, exercise. I think you can see the rest of those.
I don't see any. I got a getting outside. Oh, here we go. Spending time in nature, listening to music, connecting with friends, reading. Yes. And what is interesting is the first thing that, so let me finish the slide and then I'll jump back to that question because I think it's really valid. So much of our self-care is the first thing that goes out the window when we're stressed. And I want to talk about why that is and how that amplifies mental health symptoms. So the question was ultimately what happens when we're talking about gendered items, right? When we identify as non-binary. So non-binary includes a lot of varieties within it, right? There are some people who do not identify with either gender, which could be agender. We can be non-binary, meaning that aspects of us are more masculine or feminine. In a very complex answer to a very complex question is we get into this space of let's try to take away feminizing or feminize, feminine, oh my gosh, female or masculine traits and look at agency and communion. Agency being our individualistic, our kind of self-driven aspects of self, and communion being that caregiving role. Now, obviously, if I say masculine, we think agency, and when I say feminine, we think communion. But instead, sometimes it's easier to define each of these aspects with how we see ourselves as a caregiver or how we see ourselves as maybe more self-motivated. Not selfish, but self-motivated. Like, how do we push ourselves forward when it comes to what we want, right? So maybe being more assertive versus more empathetic in certain situations. So if we divide it into agency and communion, when we talk about this, if we identify as more of a caregiver, feminine, not that it is or isn't, but more of a caregiver, we tend to fall on that side of I'm not enough, I'm not doing enough, I am almost perfect, but still not enough, versus agency of I want to be the best and feeling like I cannot come across as weak. So if we pull the masculine and feminine from it, which is difficult given the limitations of language that we have, think of it more as agency and communion, as self-propelling versus caregiver, and how those things apply to you as we still have those aspects of ourselves. Did that answer that question? It's so weird talking to the cosmos. I'm not sure if that lands. If I didn't answer it or you have additional questions, please let me know.
I'll keep monitoring, Hannah. Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, so to jump back into this is we have our mundane everyday and we have our stressors and our self-care. And so you guys are naming really wonderful self-care things. Like I said, I eat cake if I need to soothe, which, can be either way. But ultimately, those are the things that fall away. If I'm really stressed and have a lot of things to do, exercising may not be my priority because I focus on the stress. So this is where it comes into our nervous system. We have our brakes and our gas, our parasympathetic and our sympathetic nervous system. So our sympathetic nervous system is our stress response, right? It's only meant to last 20 minutes, but unfortunately we live in it. Specifically now when we have a high level of stress because there's other things going on. What this does is it sends us to the middle of our brain. It's our limbic system. It's also referred to as your reptilian brain, and this creates this fight or flight. So the increased stress you have, you respond accordingly. So I think when you come home, you've had a really awful day, and your parents are like, well, what's wrong with you? And you're like, ugh, and you just storm off, right? You can't slow down because it's fight or flight. I'm either going to yell at you or I'm going to run away from you. And you kind of have those options, or you just look at them blindly or blankly, like I can't today, right? So being with your stress response, when it exceeds 20 minutes, you start to get in this chronic stress where you have a harder time with being in the moment, making those better decisions, but you're just kind of going off the flight of fancy in a sense. You have higher levels of risk taking, and with the increased cortisol, because of the stress response, you actually create more testosterone, whether bio-male or bio-female, which gives you a little bit of rage. Now, if you are youth in your beautiful late puberty stage, you're kind of fussy. You have highs and lows of hormones. Your body is trying to figure it out. It's kind of working against you in a sense. And the worst part is the best part of your brain for decision making hasn't quite formed yet. You don't get it until you're 25, hopefully. But with that being said, you're working with feelings and fight or flight. So when you're more stressed, the chance of you even getting into your feelings is less. So you tend to be a little bit more bitey unintentionally. The way to get out of the limbic system is for your parasympathetic, your brakes to kick in. That's breathing, that's taking a moment, that's minimizing stress, and ultimately those and having moments of connection can put your brakes on. So if you walk in and you've had a really hard day, or you're meeting with a friend who just got broken up with, or you just failed a test, you're in that limbic system, you're in that fight or flight. When someone pauses and says, "Oh, I failed my chemistry test too," it makes you feel awful. That pause, that connection slows you down. Your brakes kick in, and you're able to get to the part of your brain that is still developing, but the neocortex where all of your best decision-making lives. It's your safety, comfort, and stability. It slows you down. It also allows for you to create fire these wonderful neurotransmitters such as oxytocin, vasopressin, which create that connection. That love hormone is that you can sit with someone a lot more affectionately and a lot more kindly when you're out of that stress. That stress response is what a lot of youth live in. You guys have a lot of responsibility. You have a lot of things that are deadlines and what is due and where you're supposed to be, and meeting the expectations of your parents. So your stress response is often what we get when engaging you when it's not something you like. It's slowing you down to be able to have those moments where you're clear, you don't feel like it's personal, and taking that time. So your stress response is probably one of the biggest indicators of where you're at and how you're feeling. Quick question. Paul, you'll jump in if there's questions.
Yes, I will.
Okay, perfect. So the adolescent brain, in a sense, is a second window of opportunity. What we're doing is we're recreating neural pathways to build that connection. When we're young, we're following and mirroring others, right? And how that looks. But with puberty, those beautiful sex hormones that enter the system create this increase in growth as well as development. So it's our opportunity to create this this connection that maybe for so long we haven't had. We haven't been able to have with our parents, but we're moving that to our peers of being supportive. And as a youth, you beautiful humans have the best connections, the most committed connections to your peers. Okay. So here's what we can do. Is we want to create that connection. We want people to feel, we don't want them to feel alone. We want them to feel like they have someone with them. So this, the thing that I start with is unconditional positive regard, which seems kind of bananas. Like, why would I be nice to everybody? Because some people aren't nice. Some people are wieners. They're not all. So it's trying to find how can we respect and prize and value others without condition. In a very simple way, how do we do this non-judgmentally? How do we stay curious about other people and value them as a person? As an adult, I think we have to find this like in politics, right? It's like, oh, you're an idiot for believing what you believe, instead of staying curious and saying, this is a human who is probably caring and accepting and loving of other people, but it happens to be that we don't agree on this point. So leaning in to say, what is something that is in all of us? How can I find this space to be non-judgmental, to be curious? Because all of us are worth love and respect, even if we don't agree. That doesn't necessarily minimize someone's existence. And so as peers, I think oftentimes, gosh, I was such a butt in high school. Oftentimes I would be very quick to judge. So I went through all of the phases. I went from student council to cheerleader to tennis player to punk rock, pink hair, grumpy child. I say child because I wasn't quite 18. So in those phases, what each of them meant, how I was seen by others, and being able to surprise people because I was still the same person, but I presented differently, meant that it took people to invest in me to say, like, she's probably okay. Let's be curious about her. So ultimately what we're doing is we're trying to find a space to have positive regard for others. They're doing their best that they can. We all have our own struggle. How can I just lean in with that non-judgmental attitude? Creating a space for authenticity. This is so exciting. In our teen years, in our middle school to high school to even college, you get to figure out who the heck you are. What is it that makes you spark? What is it that your passion is? What do you hate? For a long time, I hated Brussels sprouts. Now I love them. They're delicious. But finding what is authentic to you. What is you at your core? So those 5 qualities of what it means to be authentic is you want to be true to yourself. In high school, there's so many moments where what your parents believe might not be what you believe. And so you start to challenge those things. And being true to how you feel about situations can be really beautiful. And you can grow from those. So being true to yourself, think inward and look outward. So oftentimes we're looking outward to then think inward, right? So thinking inward is, how do I feel about this situation? What do I like about this? What do I not like? And then what can I do about it in my situation, versus what is someone else doing and how do I change my behavior? So those kind of collide with one another. The way you treat others is with kindness and respect. It's that beautiful golden rule. One of my favorite stories ever is I worked with a 6-year-old, and he was just cute as a button. And he was really struggling with the golden rule of do unto others as you wish to be done to you. And bless his heart, he came to session one day, and his mom was very upset because he had hit another little girl in the face, and he was in a lot of trouble at school. So when he told me his side of the story is that he was standing in line and the little girl cut in front of him. And so he took the golden rule exactly as it is, treat others how you want to be treated. And so he cut in front of her because she cut in front of him. So she wants to be treated that way. Well, then she hit him, and so he hit her back because that's how she obviously wanted to be treated. So I think it's really interesting the way that we can misconstrue that thinking is, how do we treat others with kindness? And even when it's hard, I'm sure we hear all the time, like, take the high road, be the bigger person. But instead, just being kind, leaning in with that unconditional positive regard of, I don't understand where you're coming from, but that doesn't mean that I'm going to be unkind to you. Living in the moment and being a great listener. Listening is hard because all we do is listen so that we know how to respond instead of just taking in what someone says. So being in the moment means just listening, no judgment, just hearing what people have to say, and then responding after you've processed it. and open-mindedness and fairness to opportunities and people, giving people the benefit of the doubt, being curious about them. So these 5 qualities are for authenticity. And this quote by Brene Brown is one that I really enjoy. Is to be authentic, we must cultivate the courage to be imperfect and vulnerable. We have to believe that we are fundamentally worthy of love and acceptance just as we are. I've learned that there is no better way to invite more grace, gratitude, and joy into our lives than by mindfully practicing authenticity. If you, no matter who you are or how you present or how you identify, are genuine in your person, it invites others to be that too. If I showed up and was just alarming to all of you and you didn't believe anything I said because you didn't feel I was authentic, it would make it impossible for you to give me that same thing. And I'm sure a lot of you know people like that, where it's like they show up and you're like, oh, now we have to be fake. Same thing. Is if that person shows up being fake, you're going to get fakeness back. If you show up authentically, people will be authentic back because they feel that you're creating a space to be you, and ultimately you will be accepting of them. So empathy is really, I think, the core component of this. There is so many discussions on empathy and how we describe empathy and what empathy looks like. And oftentimes I think empathy gets melded in to sympathy. Sympathy is, I feel sorry for you, not empathy. Empathy is, I can find a part of myself that is felt that way, and I can feel that with you. And that gets very confusing for people. So I think if you, oftentimes when we think of empathy, it's like, well, if my parents have never gotten divorced, I don't know what it's like to deal with that, right? Instead of being, missing your parents, when your dad goes on a trip for 3 weeks for work, you miss him. That is just a component of that feeling that you could only imagine someone who's losing their parent to divorce or moving away feels. It's finding that piece of you inside of you to connect in that feeling in someone else, not necessarily the circumstance. And the ways that we learn empathy, we start learning empathy when we're tiny. So if any of you get the chance, or you have like little brothers and sisters that are non-speaking and they're probably babies, infants under 2 years old before they start sassing, right? Is that you can mirror feelings. So when you smile, a baby will smile back. That's that mirroring. If you're grumpy and you're like, stop crying, and they keep crying, it's mirrored back. And so we learn empathy through mirroring. We're also able to do that in moments when we're having conversations, right? When someone's telling you something really hard and you're laughing at them, that's driving disconnection. We're trying to create that connection. And ultimately, when we have shared experiences, oh man, I played tennis with someone for 4 years. She was my doubles partner. And I can't tell you how many times we would swear under our breath, and we had so many inside jokes about how we're the worst at this game and how we just want to throw our rackets. But that was a shared experience, and we both felt it together. We were able to feel it together, and we were able to experience it together. And ultimately, when you laugh with someone, when you make eye contact with someone, which I know that teens hate, but when you start making eye contact with someone, it actually starts to release oxytocin, which is a love hormone. And you can look at someone far more affectionately by having that eye contact, which is kind of crazy to think about. But also by sitting with people and exploring empathy also can release oxytocin. So to be able to do that, we want to cultivate curiosity. I can't say that enough. Be curious about people's experiences and what they bring to the table. Challenge prejudices and discover commonalities. So I would argue with any human in all of the land that a raspberry lemon cake is hands down the best. And if you think German chocolate is, you are wrong. That doesn't make you a bad person, per se. It means that my opinion is going to hold heavier for me than yours, but the commonality is that we both enjoy cake. So trying another person's life. So I'm sure a lot of you have heard putting someone else, or walk a mile in someone else's shoes. It's that same thing. Is how can you be curious and find empathy and connect with others based off of their experiences versus feeling sorry for. Inspire mass action and social change. You being authentic in the moment means that you're standing and providing a space for others to be who they are. Not who they want to be, but who they are. And that can inspire that action, is to create that space. I'm sure each of you have a moment where you stood up for someone and said, that's not okay. Or even just reached out to someone that you felt was struggling. We think of social change as a huge global thing that we need to change the world, but instead it starts with small actions. Every ripple starts small, and we have to start with those small things to connect with people, to feel like you can continue to. I hear in a lot of you, when you guys talk about like your friends, there's always a friend that you go to tell everything because they keep secrets, or they respect your boundaries and they hear you and they can connect with you. That is that social change and mass action, is by being that person that people find safe, is amazing. You also might be a future therapist. I don't know how you feel about that, but being that person to create that curiosity and space for authentic self can be pretty amazing. And develop an ambitious imagination. How do you want the world to change? And be the change that you see and that you want to see in the world. What do you want it where, I'd say the best way to practice empathy and connection is talk to your grocer. So when you go through the grocery line, when you're checking out, ask about their day, engage them in a conversation, because that's the person that probably so rarely gets that engagement. So imagine what it would be like for us to have those interactions in a positive way. When you cross the street smiling at someone, does that ripple change the way that you interact? Does that change the community that you're in? That's what I mean by imagination, to dream bigger, that we can do things to connect with one another, which I think is kind of cool. So what I want you to do is to keep in mind that empathy, positive regard, and authenticity when you're engaging with people, specifically people who don't agree with you or you have a difference. Find that commonality and to be curious and to find a part of yourself that can connect with them, that feeling. So the happiest people in the world practice gratitude, and that's part of this. Is what are you grateful for? What are the things that you look forward to that you're so grateful to have? I have the most amazing dog, and I love at the end of the day cuddling on the couch. My other half also has a dog, so they're the sweetest to snuggle on the couch with. I think I become so grateful for my other half. I'm grateful for the fact that I have a roof over my head. It's those small things. I'm grateful for my amazing penmanship. It's finding those small things. And how can we be grateful for the little things? So when I walk my dog, if I see someone, can I smile and they smile back? It's focusing on the wins. And this phrase is change is the only constant. We can't control a lot. And the thing that we can always anticipate is that things will change. So how do we lean into that and learn to get comfortable? Because so many of us are not comfortable with change. And I get it for good reason, because it's jarring and it's awful and it's not consistent or stable or safe. But how do we get more open to that idea? And the way that we do that is by checking in with our emotions. I like to think of emotions as a stoplight. It's like, do I keep going? Do I slow down? Do I stop? This can be a really wonderful tool when you're engaging with someone that just infuriates you. Once you start getting into those yellow emotions of, why can't I do this? It's okay to slow down and pick it up another time. This comes into play with your parents, I'm sure. So we want to stop and breathe. And it's that part of that self-regulation of when we were talking about stress is getting out of that limbic system and slowing down so we can put on our brakes. Because if we're riding the gas and the brakes, all we do is make smoke, in a sense. So all of this matters for a multitude of things. Is that mental health is more likely to come up during your teenage years because you're learning who you are. It feels uncomfortable. Those wonderful scripts of shame come up often. I'm not good enough. I don't know what I want. What am I going to do for the rest of my life? Those pressures are very much there. But what matters to you during your teen years and even as adults is being part of a group, is not feeling isolated, not feeling alone, but feeling that you can connect with others. And the core component of joy and happiness is to feel seen and heard. So having someone who actually understands you, to be able to connect with that part of you, that empathy, that positive regard, means that they see you, and that makes you part of a wolf pack. And that is a beautiful feeling. And truth be told, there's nothing like it. It's feeling part of a group and being seen allows you to have a greater sense of worth and higher levels of hope and a more engaged sense of self. So by creating these spaces for people, no matter who they are, no matter where they land on the binary or non-binary, whatever kind of rainbow person they are, or just human, we have to look at people as they're human and make them feel seen and wanted and heard, so that they can create those shared experiences. And all of this ultimately minimizes all of those symptoms of anxiety and depression because we're part of a group. So with all of that being said, I wanted to make sure that we had a handful of minutes for questions. And I'm going to leave this. So if you do need to get a hold of me for any reasons, or you have continuing questions, I'm happy to answer them. But are there any questions that anyone has? Because that's a lot of information, to be honest.
Hey, I gotta go just a second. So Hannah, we have a little bit of time for questions or comments if anyone has them. And Hannah, I just want to say we really appreciate your energy at 4 o'clock in the afternoon here. Somebody's saying here, wow, this was a really powerful, and loved your PowerPoint.
Oh, thank you, Barbara. That's very sweet. And I just want to leave you guys with, it really does come down to just ensuring that there's ways that we can connect and that we don't feel alone. And that's what's enhancing all of these mental health symptoms that I personally see in my private practice, as well as I've seen as a sex educator, is creating that space is so important. Sienna? I know this probably isn't your area of expertise, but any advice for people on the autism spectrum for connecting with others? Autism is so much fun. So autism just simply means that you see the world in black and white, right? It's concrete. So actually building empathy of understanding of like where this lives in them versus where it lives in others can be a very black and white conversation. One of my absolute favorite clients that I've ever worked with was a trans woman who had autism, and really learning how to get in her body and to have those relational aspects. Someone who has autism isn't completely null and void of feels. It just means that they're expressed differently in a logical sense, which sounds amazing from my perspective, but it's slowing down and saying, like, where does that live in us? Can we piece apart the logic of it, can be really powerful in understanding how that linear thought process can be for connection. And being autistic in and of itself feels isolating because I think differently. So instead of it being, I'm sure you've heard, like, instead of it being a disability, let's enhance that and say, you just see the world differently. So let's work to find words that work for you. And oftentimes I find that like body scans, slowing down and seeing where it lives in the body can be really amazing for that somatic experiencing. But also what kind of comes up, like walk it through of like, where is the logic for you and where isn't it? Where can we kind of piece those together? Because someone feeling someone who is autistic feeling disconnected can be even more isolating. So we're finding those ways to connect that may not be, I feel this way, but maybe, my stomach turns when I think of that. That's a rational black and white thought. Can be really, really helpful, which I love. I'm trying to remember the book. There's a book on autism and love. If I think of it, I will send it to Paul, I believe, or maybe Deb, to make sure that they give that as a resource.
We'd be happy to share.
Perfect. Okay. How do you promote vulnerability, especially in a world where knowledge is perceived as power and strength? I do that by living an authentic experience. It is hard to be you. It is hard to be a woman who identifies as pansexual, who is a sex therapist. I get it. Like, it is a nightmare. But I also have a lot more bandwidth to do it, to create a space for others. So promoting vulnerability in my mind is being vulnerable myself and being honest about, where I am and what I am able to do versus these are the facts. We lead into that so often, but without vulnerability, we can't be creative. We can't be authentic because it's scary to be ourselves. So sometimes it's just owning what we can in the moments that feel safe to be ourselves, to be vulnerable, to let people see us, and to connect with others, I think is so important. Knowledge is one thing, but being vulnerable enough to make mistakes and say, I want to learn from this can be just as powerful from my own experience. But it's a great question. Yes. Yeah, I don't feel seen or heard right now. I just got goosebumps. Okay, yes. And finding a community, and sometimes that community isn't even the people who already love you. It's like, I want to know that someone else has the same experience and feels the same way as I do, instead of feeling so alone in that experience. Absolutely. And the more isolation happens, or the more disconnection we feel, the more we get into that shame. And that shame manifests a lot of, am I not good enough? What did I do wrong? How do I do it better? Whatever that impossible thing is to overcome. So just being aware of it is so important. And there is a wonderful queer community here. It's finding that resource, which I am assuming Paul and our wonderful organizers will have some of those resources, because there is a solid, beautiful community here, but it is finding it, which sometimes feels like the most daunting task of finding connection.
Thanks, Hannah. A few questions have come up sent to attendees, so you probably didn't receive these. The first one is, do you think people grow out of shame?
Oh, that makes me want to that's like a kick to the stomach. Yes, we absolutely can, but it can also fester. In our social supports, in our experiences, in trauma, shame is hard. I grew up Catholic and I still have it. I haven't been practicing for a lot of minutes and I still have a lot of beautiful Catholic shame that my mom jokes will be with me forever. It's recognizing it when it comes up. It's It's working. It's working with it, not against it, to simply notice it and recognize it when it's sparking your behavior is really what it comes down to. Is like, what is that thing that I'm seeing that I'm not good enough? And how do I lean in to having that same like unconditional positive regard that I have for others, that kindness that I give others? It's working on giving it to yourself. It's working on acceptance of where we are and what we can't change, but also of all of the strengths that we have. And we are so great at focusing on the negatives, and we forget all of our positives, all of our strengths, all of the things that we've overcome. I don't really love the word resiliency, but resiliency and spunk that each of us have, because negative is big. There's some really beautiful research about how for every one negative thought, we need 10 positive. So for every one negative shame inflicting thought, we need to think of 10 things that feels good. When we say one negative thing to someone, we have to encompass that with 10 positive for them not to take the negative. And I'm sure a lot of you can relate to that in the sense of if you've ever gotten a critique, you focus on the critique, not the 45 things that people say that are great. And so shame, yes, you can overcome it. It can also fester if we're not addressing it.
And Hannah, lots of accolades coming in here too. Thank you so much. Good information. Somebody else saying sense of belonging is so important. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Hannah. Um,
Thank you guys. I think it's amazing that I got this opportunity, and I'm a person in your community that can always be of support. My contact information is there. You guys are welcome to reach out, even if it's just a question or if you need supports or resources. I will do my darndest to find that Autism in Love book. But yes, I think if we can be part of this change of building connection, of giving people a space to be them, then we begin that ripple. And I really like thinking that.
that's a wonderful message. Well, I've got the top of the hour here, 5 o'clock. So maybe that's a good note to end on. Hannah, thank you for the wonderful presentation and energy that you brought to us. Feel free to type in your contact, your email, maybe for all. I know you pulled your slide there at the end, but I think that might be helpful for folks to be able to access it. So thank you for that. Uh, any parting words, Hannah, to leave us with today?
No, I mean, you guys are all becoming part of this change of like this. I swear a lot, but this shit's important, right? It's like you guys are doing the work just by showing up. And I can't tell you how much from my end of like how that makes each of you just an absolute badass for doing it. So thank you.
Hannah, thanks so much. Really appreciate you concluding our second day of the Rainbows Over the Rockies Summit. With that, we're going to conclude. We hope you'll join us all tomorrow morning. We're going to start with a new agenda. Lots of great presentations starting at 10 a.m. tomorrow morning. So please join us then. With that, I'll say thank you again, Hannah, for joining us, and all of you for joining us today. And we hope to see you tomorrow. Thanks, everybody.